Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. In this episode, I'll be chatting with Rob Whiteman, author of the extremely insightful book called Artificially Human: Making Sense of Automation and AI. Rob had created and led the automation services line for McKinsey until his very recent transition into his career as an author. Rob's experience with solving real business problems with intelligent automation and AI spanned hundreds of companies since 2016. I'm very happy to welcome Rob to our episode today. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm sure I missed a whole lot of stuff and details within the intro. Fill us in some of those blanks and let us know what kind of led you to writing this book.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I led what was called digital service operations in North America while I was at McKinsey, and started that back in 2016 and worked with more than 200 companies on automation and AI related topics. And when I retired at the end of 2022, I had just a lot of things going around my mind and had some free time for once in my life. And I wanted to just get my thoughts organized. And so I originally wrote the book primarily for myself, just to try to get my thoughts organized, do some research to look into some of the beliefs that I had and see whether those were substantiated or not. And as I started writing, it just took shape of a book, and I started running it by a few other people who found it helpful. And that's what eventually led me to publish it. The background on it is what it does is lays out 8 mental models that I use to make sense of automation and AI. And I was just hoping that could be something that's helpful for other people that are trying to understand the space and haven't spent their career in it like you and I have.
Exactly. I have to say, when reading it, I can first of all see that you are a very experienced and accomplished consultant because of the way you presented your materials. For folks who are reading this book, they're really going to enjoy the fact that he lays it out very well. But we start talking about stuff like over the years, every modern organization, whether it's a government or commercial, they've all adopted technologies to make their operations more efficient. But I'm certain that you've worked with customers in the past that have had all the right technologies, like the right technologies, all the ERPs, et cetera. They've spent a whole lot of money on it, but they were still working inefficiently. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things going on. One, I actually write about in the book, which I refer to as digital infrastructure. And so you mentioned ERP systems or all the money that's been spent on cloud migrations. I view those as infrastructure that you're laying for the future. So those investments in of themselves don't necessarily lead to productivity in the short term. But over time, what it allows you to do is to adopt more and more what I refer to as machine labor that works on that digital infrastructure. So some of those investments could still turn out to be right, and there could still be a lot of productivity to be unlocked, but that remains to be seen. I think one of the bigger challenges is that there's been a lot of money spent on technology, not as much spent on really looking at how work gets done within the organization. And so what often happens is companies and governments will take existing manual processes and layer technology on top of them. But the thing is that machines work differently than people, and you need to really rethink how you organize the work in a way that makes it more conducive to automation and use of artificial intelligence. To give you an example, if you look at the underwriting process in insurance, the way that's been done historically is you have people build files, and on the processors, they would create a file. They would then hand it to an underwriter who may or may not make a decision and pass it back. And so you had this batch processing, but in an automated system, you actually can just do continuous underwriting. You can underwrite every time you get a new piece of information. You can run the model and see whether or not that policy would be approved. And most organizations don't take that extra step to redo their processes and policies to make it more conducive to automation.
That makes sense to me. And we've both been talking with customers about automation for many years, but these automation efforts only in the most mature organizations are where you really get some benefit or some potential, but even then they're just scratching the surface. What do you think is holding them back?
So I think some of it is related to the fact that these organizations have built up over time around those manual processes. So if you take something like complexity, if you run an organization that has a lot of manual processes, yes, there's some negative aspects of complexity when it comes to context switching, things like that. But those limitations are amplified as you start trying to automate the work. So I think part of it is just the overall complexity of organizations that have built up over years does make it very difficult to automate as is. I think the other big thing, though, and perhaps even bigger, is just the inability to scale successes. So I often will see in organization some really amazing things done as proof of concepts or done in one small part of the organization. But the challenge becomes taking that and scaling it up and really trying to build it. And I think the mistake that a lot of organizations make is that they start by trying to take their at scale operation and automate it versus taking one of these smaller things that they're able to automate from the beginning and then scale that. And so I think that scaling path and how you take those early successes and scale them up tends to be a better path. And then the last thing I'd mention there is I think for a lot of companies, especially, they don't yet view what's happening in the world of automation and AI as an existential threat. It's something that is an opportunity. It's something to think about, but on a daily basis, it doesn't always occupy as much mind share. But look, as the technologies get more and more capable over time, I think you'll start to see organizations just like the business process outsourcers and to some extent the banks have started to see technology as an existential threat to the way they do business. I think you'll start to see that make its way into other sectors, and that could show some acceleration of the efforts internally.
I can understand that. As we've seen the way they view automation and technology, oftentimes this is viewed, and you mentioned it here, that you start looking at these very complex processes and it all of a sudden there's the analysis paralysis. You can't do anything because it's so large. But there's a need or desire or an imperative to be more efficient. We had to find a way to cut our costs and be more efficient. So automation tends to be the thought, if we are able to automate this, we can automate X number of FTEs out of the equation or out of our organization because we can replace that with automation. And that seems like a very similar refrain that we've heard for many years about Lean and Six Sigma. We keep on squeezing. We can make this process perfect in every sense. So it's automated, it's perfect. You have some thoughts about that, though, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart. So one of the first things I did early in my career was I was a Six Sigma black belt and then a Six Sigma master black belt when I was at GE. So I do have a background in Lean Six Sigma and the power those have in organizations when it comes to generating efficiency. I think though automation is a bit different than those disciplines. If I think about Lean and Six Sigma, the problem that you're trying to solve were the inherent drawbacks of using manual labor. There's a lot of waste variability and inflexibility in processes that you do manually. So for example, it's hard to get 50,000 call center agents to all do things exactly the same way. There's going to be variability, some of which is good, some is bad. There's waste in how people do work. We don't always do things in the most efficient way. And so those disciplines were really focused on taking out that waste variability and inflexibility. It's a bit different as you start thinking about automation because the cost of automation is very front loaded. There's a lot of work that goes into really understanding the process, redesigning the process, investing in the technology now to automate the process. And what that investment gets you is a really big unit cost advantage on the back end. So now you have a process that is way, way more efficient than the manual process. But the problem is, if you just use that to do the same things you were doing before you did the automation, the math usually doesn't work. That initial investment usually wasn't worth it to generate a unit cost advantage that then essentially you just continue doing the same work you were doing before. So in order to generate the efficiency in a more automated model, what I tend to push organizations to do is really focus on growth as the main driver of efficiency. So once you create that unit cost advantage, how are you creating new avenues for growth, either doing more work, adding additional enhancements to your existing products and services, or finding new markets that you can enter because now you have a unit cost advantage? If you don't have a path to really grow the output of the organization, it becomes hard to make the economics work with automation with respect to efficiency.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you talk about the efficiency piece, and you mentioned the fact that people will do things differently because we're people. We have different viewpoints, different perspectives on things. And while we'd like to think that everyone's able to follow a script and be exactly the same, especially inside a contact center, the reality is that all of us have our own unique ways of doing specific things, which may not be exactly to script. When we start looking at machines, humans and machines obviously work very differently. People have emotional, analog interactions with experiences, right? Machines, they interact with data. So as we add automation and AI into our work and even our personal lives, we're adapting the ways these machines interact. But are these machine interactions affecting us? Are we transitioning into machines ourselves, or are the machines actually becoming more human?
Yeah. So I have a chapter in the book called Like Us, and this was one of the favorite parts of the book that I enjoyed really diving into and researching and then writing. And I think the belief that machines are becoming more like us, I think that's pretty well documented. If you've used any of the large language models that are out there, they start to behave like a person or more like a person. You can converse with them. You don't necessarily need to be able to code in order to have a conversation with the machine. Or there's models out there like Replica, even that have AI companions. So I think that there's a lot of focus that's dedicated toward how machines are becoming more like us. What I found more interesting as I dove into it was how we're becoming more like machines. If you look at the fact we're engaging through digital channels, everything I do now, and COVID accelerated this, it's through mobile apps, websites, things like that. So I'm engaging through digital channels. People's vocabulary actually seems to be changing, and it's correlation, not necessarily causation, but the average vocabulary that people use is getting smaller and more efficient. And even you look at the number of people that are learning coding languages. So I actually think it's really interesting to see the trends and the ways in which people are becoming more like machines. At the same time, machines are becoming more like people. And that trend, I would expect, is going to accelerate even more as we start to enter the age of augmented reality and virtual reality. The hardware is not nearly where it needs to be for that to be adopted at large right now. But I do think that idea of having a more seamless human in the loop design of how work gets done and even just how society functions, I think you're going to continue to see more and more of that convergence in the next several years.
I would agree. And all I have to say to that is 0110001. Okay.
I agree 100%.
But you make a point there about the changes from a societal perspective. As we are being trained, you mentioned this in COVID, but the reality is that over this period of 20 some odd years, with the web being very ingrained in how we interact with long distance stuff or with companies now, and now we transition to apps where it's very simple and easy for us to interact with a device that we have with us all the time. There's this training, if you will, to become obviously dependent on these type of things, but also in a way that we interact with them. So as you see all these kind of changes, how do you see our society adopting or adapting to these changes in this human and digital labor?
Yeah, I'll start this by saying there's a lot of conversation where you show up in the press that tends to take a very, I think, cynical or negative view of where things are headed, at least in the intermediate term. And I tend to be a bit more optimistic about what the implications are of automation and AI over the next several years. And I think that if you look at historically, the way we've run society is on human labor. And so if I look at say a common job, so you think about an accounts receivable clerk or somebody working in a retail sales location, a lot of people don't necessarily grow up wanting to do the thing they end up doing for a living. We have to have people do that because we need human labor to power society. And in exchange for doing things that we may not always find personally fulfilling, we get a paycheck. And that's just how society's worked. And that's been the bargain. And as I look forward, though, we're still in the very early stages of growing a digital workforce. And the numbers I threw out there in the book are, what does a world look like with 4 billion human workers and 100 billion machine workers? It looks very different than it does today. And in that, if you start to think about things that way, you start to think about this, that we have a massive digital workforce that's coming online. I think the way that starts to change society is really in all aspects of how we run in an economy. When it comes to hiring, developing, and retaining talent, it's not just human talent, it's digital talent. Which APIs are you using? What platforms? How are you developing those platforms? How are you protecting your data using through cybersecurity threats? There's a whole idea of how you think about managing digital talent. When it comes to policy making, you start to have to think about, you can't just keep taxing human labor. You got to start focusing more on how you're taxing machine labor in order to run government services. And you also need to think about the whole alignment issues and how you make sure that the machines that are being scaled up are in line with what you're trying to do and advances society. And in education, I think for all of us individually, there's going to be a much higher premium on continuous learning. This idea that you have somebody who goes to school for a couple of decades, gets a degree, and then the rest of their life engages in no formal education to build new skills, everything else is on the job. That model is going to make a lot less sense in a world where you continually are adding new digital workers to the economy, and you need to find new innovative ways to work with those digital workers. So I think education is going to have to become a much more continuous and ongoing aspect of society as opposed to a one-time endeavor like we have it organized right now.
And I know you're not an expert on this particular thing, but you certainly have enough anecdotal information and your lens as a consultant to form an opinion on it. When you start talking about education as a whole, we both have kids, right? And we start looking at the education that our children received compared to what we received. And it really didn't change much since when I went to college and when my daughters went to college. And as we're looking at that, you're seeing a different world now, certainly, than when I went to school. So how do you think education will or has to change to be able to adopt to that?
Yeah, and so I have a daughter right now that's going into her second year of college, and I I do think there's a lot of things her university is doing extremely well. As an example, there's a big focus on this idea of not what, but how. So rather than just inundating you with a lot of information, really focusing on how you build the critical thinking skills, realizing that their information is ubiquitous. You can go online and find a lot of what you need. And so the goal isn't to just impart information, it's to help you figure out how to use the information. So I do think there are some good steps being taken by universities and in general. I think, though, that there's two big things that I tend to come back to on this. One is that the focus historically has largely been on being the best. How do I be the best person in this field? How do I be the most expert person in this field? How do I be the most efficient person in my field? It's this competitive dynamic. And I think one of the implications of automating, especially a lot of things that are routine and the work that exists today, is there's going to be a much bigger premium on being the only versus the best. And I think that the implication for universities is they're going to have to embrace this idea of a multidisciplinary education, of programs that are more flexible and allow students to study in different schools to create more custom and tailored degrees. I think universities are going to have to relax the rigidity with which they're organized and how they design their programs to give students flexibilities to create things that are more unique and more valuable in the world. And the second thing that I come back to on this is that within education, the idea of continuous learning, I think institutions need to view it as a lifelong endeavor. It's not enough to just wipe your hands of your responsibility for your students once they graduate. That's the beginning of the journey. It's not the end. And I think that model was fine historically, but if you look at now, yes, universities offer certificate programs, but do they really stand behind those with the same rigor as their degrees? In most cases, no. And I think that needs to change. I think universities need to stand behind the education they provide on a continuing lifelong basis with the same rigor and efficacy that they do with the education they do for those handful of years that you're actually there on campus.
That makes sense. I certainly can see that. And we talked about this, there's the education that we have, and those kids grow up to be adults. Those adults then go to work for one or more employers over their lifetime. And as we start seeing this transition, bringing in additional digital labor, We've always heard that our people are our secret sauce and secret ingredient, and it's all about our people. And I think we start looking at the difference between what people are good at, what digital workers are good at. Does it even become take an added layer of meaning, having the people truly be the secret sauce for successful organizations because they're the ones that have purpose and have creativity versus the efficiencies that sort of are built into a digital worker.
Yeah, I think two things can be true, which is historically that statement of our people, our secret sauce, I think was true because the organization ran on human labor. If you look during COVID, when you started shutting down organizations and not allowing people to go to work or engage in work in a productive way, the economy shut down. We still, despite the fact that we have a lot of technology in organizations, most organizations are still largely human powered. So I think that statement in the past of our people are our most important asset, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any company for which that was not true. I think going forward, it's just the role starts to change, which is if you buy into this idea of we're heading toward a world with, say, 4 billion human workers and 100 billion machine workers, the role that people play is different. How do I really harness the value of these digital workers? How are they developed, organized, and led and managed? And so it starts to create a higher bar for people to be able to essentially harness the productive capacity of the machines in a way that over time continues to create fulfilling jobs and fulfilling roles. I think that the dynamic is going to change. And frankly, the verdict is still out of what that transition looks like. And to what extent do you see that virtuous cycle happen where people harness the power of technology and create better and better jobs for themselves? And the flip side, I worry about a lot, which is, do you end up with a lot of exception handling and other types of more service level jobs that maybe are not as fulfilling that are needed just to keep the machines running? And how does the workforce start to split between those different types of roles? I think on the one hand, there's a lot of really amazing jobs that are going to be created. I think on the other hand, there's a lot of jobs that frankly are not going to be that great. And I don't candidly have a really good idea of what that ratio is going to look like over time.
So do you think that we're moving to a new renaissance where this idea of work and the creativity component, where it becomes more, I guess, relevant or prevalent within the human side, will actually allow us to express ourselves in more better, different ways than we have in the past because we've been too busy being transactional processing workers?
I do think it will. I think it will be a bit different than what is articulated as common convention. The standard narrative tends to be everybody's going to become artists and writers, painters, things like that. I don't see that necessarily happening. If anything, there's
Wait a second. Wait, you were a consultant and you just wrote a book. All right. So I'm just saying you're not proving the point here.
So I'll say that I enjoyed writing a book, and you don't write, anybody out there considering writing a book, I'll just say you definitely don't write a book to get rich. It is a really enjoyable experience. It's not necessarily something that you are paid a lot of money to do. So I definitely see a renaissance in the context of, will people have more time to pursue things they enjoy, which for me, one of those things is writing. Absolutely. I think that, and I think and hope that's one of the outcomes here as we have a growing digital workforce, and that would be a byproduct. Will you get paid for those skills and for those things? I'm not sure. The very first thing in my book is an attestation, and I went back and forth on whether to add this, but the very first words of Artificially Human read, these words written by me, a human, and then I say, machines helped with the footnotes. I think that's going to be really important. I think as we start to see more and more content developed by machines, more and more work being done by machines, I think we're going to come to appreciate the talents of other humans in a way where knowing something was crafted by a person, even if it's not as good as a machine, we will come to value those things, and we'll come to value philosophical debate. We'll come to value other types of things that maybe today don't have the same worth, but will value them just purely because they're human. And those don't necessarily have to be creative endeavors. They can be a lot of different things. I value scientific ideas that are developed by people as well. So I think that you'll just start to see more and more value placed on the human aspect of pretty much everything that gets developed in society.
Do you see any dark side to that?
I see a potential dark side if we maintain our existing policies and the way that we organize society. If that does not change, I think we end up in some very dangerous places. So I mentioned, for example, the tax code. The tax code, at least in the United States, this varies a little bit country to country, but it is largely driven by human labor. We tax human labor and we use those proceeds to provide goods and services to public goods and services. And that is not a sustainable model. As you have more and more digital workers, you're going to be taxing an ever shrinking pool of labor. And if you're not taxing kind of the capital, you end up with some situations potentially where the people that are struggling the most in the workforce are also the ones that are being taxed the most and carrying the highest tax burden. So I think if we don't change systems like that, there could be some really dark outcomes, but I generally have faith that we will. I don't think it's going to necessarily require a revolution. I think it's going to require an awareness of what's going on, an understanding of what's going on, and some recognition that some things need to change. And that was really what drove me to write the book. And it wasn't because I believe that there's going to be a million people reading this book and running out and making changes. But even if a few hundred people take some of the ideas in the book and run with them, I think that starts to make a difference. And the more and more people that take that approach and tend to be optimistic and change things for the better, I think we'll all be better off for it.
I love that. That's great. You have a very optimistic viewpoint on it, and I appreciate the way you see that. So on that note of optimism, now that you have made this transition from more of a full-time workforce into more of a, I want to say part-time workforce, an at will or at desire time to work, how do you see things differently? And when it comes to the societal and AI impacts that you had been working with companies before on, and where you see things potentially going?
Yeah. One of the things I mentioned in the book is this idea of a company of one. And the idea is that as you have more and more machines and digital labor out there, you can do way more today as an individual than you could have a decade ago, or most certainly 2 or 3 decades ago. And so I hope that just this idea of being able to build a business, build an organization that you can run your own. I like to say semi-retired in that I still work, but I only focus on those things that I enjoy. And there's a large team of digital workers behind me that are supporting what I'm doing. It's what allows me to still do some consulting. It's what allows me to build applications like I have one called Paper to Podcast that reads research papers and produces podcasts. So those digital workers are really what allow me to do things that I enjoy that I never would have been able to do even going back several years. Hope that, that's one implication of what I'll be doing in the future is the ability to keep building things and doing things that are interesting. And I think the other big thing is just having the time to sit back. I think all of us can probably relate to this feeling of fragmentation and getting pulled in a million different directions and not really having time that is your own to spend on things that just give you satisfaction, fulfillment, and enjoyment. And for me, at least, it's only been 8 months or so, but that's been by far the best part of is the 2-hour walk with the dogs on a random day that allow me to just get my thoughts organized and enjoy the world. That's been a huge change, and I think just good for my mental health. And I hope that that's something more and more of us can enjoy in the coming years as the digital workers pick up the slack from us.
You've just depressed me since I am working and I don't have the ability to take a 2-hour walk with my dog in the middle of the day. But I appreciate your view on that. So Rob, I want to say thank you. Your insights that you share with us today, as well as the host of more of them in the book, are fantastic. I recommend this book highly for anybody who's in the automation and AI field. Rob, again, has been doing this with lots of companies, and he understands from a bunch of different perspectives not only how difficult this is, but how to change the way you approach it to make it successful. So, Rob, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more,